I will call this work session to order. It's 1:03 p.m. Today is the 9th of June, 2023. We are here in discussion of a proposed ordinance 2023-60, the basis of design concept submitted by the Port of Alaska, and also to hear more on the details of the Design Advisory Board and proposals or requests for information from the last work session. And so there isn't an agenda for this meeting. We're going to let the port staff run us through their proposal, and then we will engage in conversation. It might be members have questions that are germane to the moment. I guess now we'll do introductions.
George Martinez.
Kevin Cross.
Zach Johnson. Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley.
Daniel Bullock.
Christopher Constant on the phone. We have Karen Braga, I believe.
Yeah.
There she is. And then from the staff,
Steve Rebuffo, Port Director.
David Ames, Program Manager, Jacobs Engineering.
John Daly, Port of Alaska, Engineering Manager.
Eric Adams, Jacobs Design Manager.
all right, and we have a number of people in the audience as well. So like I said, there's no really set agenda. Mr. Rebuffo, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much. Blessing or curse, but the intent is for me to do most of the talking here this morning, and you can defer to other folks if you'd like to. That's perfectly okay with me. But before we get started into this, I want to do a little context setting with respect to why we are even here doing this. The municipality of Anchorage owns a port. That's not unique. You go up and down the East Coast, up and down the West Coast and the Gulf Coast, and local government jurisdictions own the ports. City of Los Angeles owns LA Long Beach. The city of Seattle and Tacoma own those ports. New York City owns Port of New York side of the river, and New Jersey owns the New Jersey side of the river. But the difference between all of them and you is you also manage the port and operate the port and are responsible for all the associated contracts and leases and big purchases. That's not the way it is everywhere else, but that's the way it is here. So you are not only an owner, but you're the owner operator. So the mindset we would like you to take on as we walk through this presentation today is you got to think of yourself as the owner, not the political side of the oversight government piece of this. You are the owner operator of the port, and we who are down there every day, boots on the ground, are your representatives down there doing the best we can to keep the place open for business and maintained in a safe way so that the port users can operate safely. And we are also the ones that are going to give you advice with respect to what we think is in the best interest of not necessarily just the users, but the ultimate stakeholders, which are the 87% of the state population that benefit from this port being here. And we need you to put that hat on when we walk through this and kind of give you the reasons behind why it is we think what we're recommending in AO 2023-60 is in the best interest of the state of Alaska for the long haul. Okay. So when we met in December 20th, this was the agenda for the meeting. We had an originally approved basis of design that was presented to the Assembly and approved by the Assembly in June of 2021. And there's the AO number for it. And we've got some pictures that'll follow. But we took to the Design Advisory Board a request to change that up with respect to not so much Terminal 1, but Terminal 2. That instead of having a 3-trestle structure that didn't provide a whole lot of flexibility with respect to anybody else who could use that particular facility, we wanted to create something that was a contiguous dock of equal width, so that if we wanted to run crane rails and operate ship-to-shore cranes from one end to the other, we have the capability and the flexibility to do that. So that was the marching orders. This was what was approved and recommended by the Assembly in June of 2021. Fortunately, I think for us all, we didn't get much past that before, even as a group working with the users, we came to the appreciation that that would have been insufficient to provide any level of flexibility with respect to what else you could do with Terminal 2. So the interim agreement was, we could extend the contiguous terminal into Terminal 2, and we eyeballed the width as 69 feet or thereabouts, because that's what the existing dock is now. The entire length of it is 69 feet. But we knew we had to upgrade the cranes and get more modern cranes, so we needed a wider berth in Terminal 1. But what this does is it doesn't allow you to run those gantry cranes all the way to the north end, because it's just flat not wide enough. So with that in mind, this was what the Design Advisory Board discussed when we met in December, and this is what we are requesting your approval. Well, we sent it to the mayor, and the mayor then sent the request to you all to approve this basis of design. It's a cartoon. There's no flesh on these bones, but this is the structure that we think is going to provide us, the best flexibility into the future. And that's where we'd like to start. Okay. This is a profile view of what that would look like if you were, standing on the water at the south end of the dock looking north. That's a 100 gauge crane by scale. The reason why I said it was the previous one was a cartoon is because as yet not determined is the driving lane configuration. Here we have 2 driving lanes under the cranes and 1 behind the cranes. Can all 3 be under the cranes? Yeah. There's a little bit of negotiation and a little bit of work with the designer of record that has to take place, but this is kind of fundamentally what it is we're looking for. And right now, the focus is Terminal 1, but we would like this concept to go forward all the way to the north end. I threw this in here, not necessarily to scare the living daylights out of people, but this is to give you an understanding of what it is we've got, ship-to-shore crane-wise, and where it is we're going. The small gray crane is a 38 gauge crane, which is the gauge is the distance between the rails that the cranes ride on. The little one is a little bit shorter than the ones that we have on the dock right now, but the crane gauge, the rail gauge is exact. The larger crane behind it is 100 gauge. So you can appreciate the difference between 38 gauge and 100 gauge and why the dock has to be a little wider. Those cranes, though, are way bigger than what we're going to see here because they're taller by a little bit more, and they reach out further than what it is we need here, because these, they call them jumbo cranes for a reason. These were built for those huge container ships that sail from Asia and Europe to the big ports on the east and the west coast that we will never see up here. But when you look at the gauge and you look a little bit when you're comparing the difference between the size of one and the size of the other, this gives you a pretty good idea of where we are and where we're going.
I'm going to jump in there, Steve. Why didn't you present to us a version that shows it in scale to what is being proposed as opposed to what's possible in the world?
Well, that's, the gauge is what matters, and I frankly could not find a picture that was exact. So I thought I would talk to that one. It's not I hope you don't think it's misleading, because that was not the intent. The intent was to show you that when you look at the gauge of the crane, 38 and 100, there's a pretty appreciable difference between the two, and the gauge is accurate.
Maybe then you should describe for us with that picture what you mean by gauge. What part of that picture is the part that is to scale?
Okay, the part to scale is the distance between the legs that are on the dock that the cranes are standing on.
Okay.
That's, yeah. The height is off a little, but the width is accurate.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So why should this matter to all of you and us, the owner? Because when you're operating in the shipping industry, you don't operate in a vacuum. You're part of a larger group of ports that interact and interrelate. The one we deal with the most is Tacoma, obviously, but there are opportunities that, for dealing with others when vessels come from other locations. And when we're making a decision that's going to be for 75 years, the context you have to think about is, we have preferential user agreements with the 2 ocean carriers that come here that give them absolute access and use of those particular docks 2 days a week, on Sunday and on Tuesday. The other 5 days, they're ours. They're ours to put whoever we want where we want to in order to keep the place open for business for others. We also have to look at the 3 missions that this port has. It's not just all about commerce. We have a mission in support of the Department of Defense, and we have to be able to support any kind of vessel that the Department of Defense sends up to us for the onloading and offloading of equipment. And we also have a mission in support of FEMA and the State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management as a place where, in the instance of a natural disaster that adversely impacts the state of Alaska, that this port is above the waterline and part of the solution, that anything that would have to come up here to deliver relief supplies can be serviced. So we think about all of that when we are in the context of deciding what it is we think the best way forward on the infrastructure is. But we also have to appreciate the fact that we have current customers that have to continue to be able to do business here and not be adversely affected by what it is we've designed. And I think what we are going to present to you all is a design that not only works for the current users, but will also work for us going out 70 years. And that's a very important thing. Some of them may have more infrastructure than they would need day to day, but there's a 2 days a week requirement, and then there's a 7 days a week requirement. And I have to keep an eye on what it is we would need for the greater requirement. And at the end of it all, when you look at that design, it's pretty much exactly what we have now, only modern and bigger. And here's what I mean by that. So I took these pictures standing in Terminal 3, looking south. And that puts me in the berth that we've assigned to Tote. And you can see Tote's ramp, one of their 3 ramps there in the background, and behind them, the 3 gantry cranes. But that rail lines up with the shoreside rail of those gantry cranes. So once upon a time, somebody thought it was a good idea to have crane rail on this dock that ran the entire length of it. And then the other picture is the front rail. Did we fill them in? Yeah, we filled them in because the current user of Terminal 3 doesn't have cranes, doesn't use cranes in their business model. And for safety reasons, not to have a tripping hazard there all the time. And because we can't bring the cranes down there if we wanted to anyhow, it made sense to fill that in. And the reason why we can't bring those cranes all the way down is, the way these cranes are powered, this generation of cranes, the way they're powered is through a thing called a bus bar. It's that raised, it almost looks like a monorail that goes behind the crane that the cranes are connected to. The arrow is pointing to it right there. That's how these cranes get powered. They're electric, and they ride up and down that to move around inside the extent of that bus bar. We did not extend the bus bar all the way to the other end of the port, because if we did that, then Tote's roll-on, roll-off ramps could not interact with the bus bar being there. The bus bar would frankly be in their way. So in order to allow them to conduct their operations the way they need to conduct their operations, we cut the bus bar short. But the crane rail was already put in. Point being, at one point in time in the past, somebody thought it would be a good idea to have crane rail that ran the entire length of the dock. And from a flexibility of operations standpoint, it still makes a good idea. But that particular conflict of business models and relationships doesn't work, no, it is not an issue anymore. I was at the Port of Savannah in August, and I took this to show you the way you power ship-to-shore cranes now. They've got 90 of these. 36 of these 90 gauge cranes, they're in Savannah. But the way you get power to the cranes now is you see that wheel that one arrow is pointing to. That reel has all the cable on it. And then it runs down the front leg of the crane and rides in a trench along the waterside edge of the berth. And as the crane's got to move, it either rolls out cable or it reels in cable and moves up and down on the tracks. Yeah. With that kind of a configuration, then you don't interfere with, you wouldn't interfere with totes ramps, because those ramps can run all the way up to the edge of the dock and not hurt the cable. And you can move them out of the way if you had to do ship-to-shore crane operation in that same berth on the day that tote was not here. So there's no interference anymore between the ro-ro ramps and the cranes, because the more modern configuration of the technology, has pretty much resolved that issue. And I think the other thing we have to take into consideration is the fact that, this is a 70-year decision, and we don't know the kinds of vessels that are going to come here in 70 years. We don't know who the port users are going to be in 70 years. And if the port users are who they are today, we don't know if they're going to be sailing the same vessels. So you want to have a certain amount of flexibility in order to respond to that as well. Here's a good example. That tote maritime vessel, the MS Isabella, sails from Jacksonville to Puerto Rico. It's a standard container ship, just like what Matson brings here now. And conversely, Matson, that's the MS Lurleen that Matson sails from Oakland to Hawaii. Not only does it have containers, but the back end of it is ro-ro. So we don't know what these guys are going to be bringing up here, and if they choose to stick around for the next 20 or 30 years. So you need infrastructure that will give you the flexibility to adjust to that, knowing what the industry tends to provide.
So that raises a great question. We had a presentation at the last meeting that we were being asked to build a port for just one user, one dock, the only person that could use it. But clearly you are now putting before us a photograph that Matson has a ship that could in fact use a ro-ro dock should they choose to move that up here. And so this picture is actually in direct conflict with the statements of the meeting the last time we met, I think, because.
Well, we never really got into this level of detail at the last meeting.
Oh, no, it was stated plainly. It was stated plainly that the only user that can use the Terminal 2 ro-ro facility is tote.
And that's still true, because those ramps were constructed for their vessels. Those ramps are not interchangeable with anybody else's. In fact, I've watched this ship unload in Oakland, and the ramp is vastly different than what we have here.
Mr. Cross.
Well, on the same side, it was my understanding tote up here only had ro-ro, but we know now they also have.
Right.
So
Exactly.
I mean, they both have malleability. It just depends on what's available for their fleet coming up here.
What the market
The point
demands.
is, we need a facility that will provide us the flexibility to deal with whatever the shipping industry is going to send here now and in the future.
Mr. Martinez.
Yeah, just to be clear, there's different types of ro-ros. So what's being said is that the current ro-ro to the tote setup that we have is established to their boat
No,
versus this ship. Is that different?
Correct.
And
it's the opposite though, Steve.
Correct.
We went through this. It's the tides. It's not the ship.
No.
The ship is constructed to meet the needs of the tides.
That's correct.
It's not that the dock is built to meet the needs of the ship. It's the other way. It's the
Yeah.
water. It's not.
David,
the
why don't
operate-
you see if you can?
David Ames from Jacobs Engineering. I don't know the history of what was built first, the vessel or the dock, but what I can say is the tides serve serve the tote vessels in one way, but the real configuration issue is the spacing of the ramps, which are the spacing of the trestles, which allow the ramps to connect to the Orca class of vessels. They are designed, the spacing is designed specifically for the Orca class of vessels. You're correct, Mr. Martinez, it doesn't serve this specific ship.
So let's keep moving a little bit, see if we can get some clarity to this as we proceed to this. So we put this in here because in our little world up here in Alaska, we don't appreciate how container ships have evolved in the rest of the industry from the 1950s when containerization was first invented, all the way up to what it is you see going into the big ports on the east and west coast now. What you got to get an appreciation for is those big ones will never come here. We operate at the smaller end of the spectrum and probably always will, because the population doesn't require anything any bigger. So we've identified where we are, and we know that as we create this new port, the users are going to be looking for how to take the best advantage of the new size of it and bring in more modern vessels. So we have a real good handle on the will-be vessel size that is coming here. And then there's a possibility that, in 75 years, you can conceivably see something that's bigger, in which case you want to be able to be prepared to deal with that if and when the day comes. So, this is a part of how the shipping business works. We don't really pay attention to around here. We live in our own little world, but this is this is how things are outside the state. And just in accounting of the kinds of vessels that we have seen here over the past several years, and where we've been able to put them because of the configurations of the terminals. And I think you'll look and you'll see that there's even the same names in a couple of different places. And sometimes it's because we had to move them to fit into a different terminal because of something else that was going on at the time, or because the vessel was so big, it exceeded the size of a particular terminal and spilled into the other. But this kind of gives you a sense of where we get the usability out of the existing dock because of the types of ships that come here and what it is they need for operating space. And as I think we started to allude to, we put this graphic in here to give you an appreciation for the fact that when we complete this design, if there ever is an opportunity, whether we're adding another port user because the business case requires it, or vessels get to a point where they might not be big enough, or where the dock may not be long enough to handle them, there is space to expand to the north and as part of this modernization program, because building this new dock with just terminals 1 and 2, we're moving out and we're moving south. So all of that to the north opens up as expansion area if and when it should ever be needed. So this is just kind of give you a sense that even though we're looking at this design here, if there's a business case for making the dock longer, there's space to do it. You haven't committed to something that's going to hamstring you in 50, 60, 70 years. Okay. So let's look at the big ports and what it is their infrastructure looks like, right? These are container ports, predominantly container ports, and they also handle a variety of other things. But I wanted to put these up here so you can get an appreciation for why gantry cranes are a big deal. And this is Tacoma, Los Angeles, and ports in New York, New Jersey. And this is what things look like down in San Diego and the port industry gold standard of Rotterdam. Just to give you an appreciation for when you deal with the port industry, what it is the port industry is as a standard arrangement dealing with itself. And I tossed this one in here because it was interesting. For another reason, I was talking to my colleagues at the Port of Jacksonville, and they sent me a picture of their port. And if you look at that vessel that's up against the dock favoring the right side of the right side of the picture up there, that's the tote vessel that goes to Puerto Rico, sitting underneath ship-to-shore cranes. Yeah. So again, there's a need to keep that kind of flexibility in whatever it is we design.
Mr. Volland.
Thank you. This is very interesting, and these are very impressive pictures. There's a note at the bottom of the 2 slides back that says, "Did you spot the common theme?" And I see where you're going on the common theme, but I would also suggest that one of the common themes is that all of these ports serve much larger populations than the Port of Alaska.
Yes, they do. And when you're focusing exclusively on the commerce mission, that's an excellent point. Yeah. So
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. And this is going to be a bigger question than these individual slides, but I think it's worth putting on the table now, especially since we're a half hour into this work session. The other common theme that is not represented on these slides is the fact that I'm guessing these ports have a master plan. And I'm wondering, that's a common facility feature, right? Is that there's a master plan. That's where a lot of these big picture discussions about need, about projected need, about potential expansion in the future. In my district, the Ted Stevens International Airport is going through an update of its facility master plan, and that is the general basis of major facilities like these to have made these decisions through in a thoughtful process. And so I appreciate the explanation of why we need, for example, container shipping. I agree that is an industry standard, and it has continued to grow, the ships and the amount of traffic that moves around the world. But I also wonder why we're not looking at a master plan. So I recently just looked at the website of the port. I don't see one. It looks like the last one was completed in 1995, potentially. And so I just want to, again, put on the table, I'm frustrated with this discussion overall because I believe it has not been really based in those basic planning principles.
Well, and I'm going to disagree with you, but I'm also going to play a little, it's not a word game, but give you my opinion of what we've got going on here. And I look at that 1999 master plan because it sits on my desk. It's not a master plan. It's a strategic plan. It takes into account not only the ports, infrastructure requirements, the business model, the business cases, what's coming down the pike, what needs to be prepared for, and on and on. Darn thing is that thick. That's the port master plan. It was done in 1999. And you're right. That's a long time ago, and we need to do that again. We tried to do that again 7 years ago and got told, no. You're not going to do that. What's more important is build a new port. Now, to me, a master plan is all about the infrastructure. So in my opinion, and I could be wrong and you can disagree, but the Port of Alaska Modernization Program is in fact the master plan for the infrastructure at this port. What we need to update, and we have a business plan that was done 7 years ago that we definitely need to redo. And I think I even put something in my budget for a new strategic plan in this budget. Life has gotten in the way. We may get started a little later than I had planned to, but that is definitely on the books to do. But master plans, as I understand them, go to infrastructure. Strategic plans go to the overall business of the entity. That needs a little bit of updating, but this is an interesting market. It hasn't changed in 20 years. The population hasn't changed. People, the numbers have not grown. People only eat so much, go buy new clothes so often, put gas in their car tanks once a week, buy a new car every 10 years. That's a really, really, really predictable demand. So what you've got to do to accommodate that is no different now than it was 10 years ago. But what we haven't done is we haven't kept the infrastructure up with the changes in the times. That's been the way I've been looking at this. Right or wrong, that's the way I've been looking at this.
Yeah, thank you. And I should clarify, I'm not suggesting that we pause what we're doing or that we delay the decisions that we make about the design of the port based on the fact that we do need a master plan at some point. I guess what I offer.
We need a strategic plan at some point.
Oh, sure, whatever we want to call it, some kind of planning document. But where I see the issue being is that because we don't have that unified plan and we've had these changes over the last year, maybe there's great changes, maybe this is the best possible design we could have. But what it's done is it's had the consequence of introducing more uncertainty into the process and into our ability to get funding. And so that is what I'm concerned about. And I believe that that if we do not come to a decision about what our long-term vision and plan for this port is, or at least through this design process, that it will make it continually more difficult for us to be able to fund it, which puts us backwards. And so I just want to put that on the table because I know there's also been discussion of making a decision about part of the design first and dealing with the rest of it later. And I would strongly caution against that for the reasons I just stated. But also I'm really interested in basically using this process to come to agreement on a design so that we can move forward and ask our funders at the federal and state level and other users and say that we have a plan and that we're ready to execute it.
And your points are all well taken. And we probably need to do a little bit better job of advertising that all of those considerations go into the decisions that we're making. And we just haven't done a very good job of doing that. I'll concede that.
I have another question, but the risk, I don't think, is that we find it continually more difficult to get funding. The risk is the state's just going to take the port from us. And then Juneau's going to make these decisions, and it'll be just like the highways in Anchorage. And so that is not, I think, in the best interest at this time. Steve, your slide, do you spot the common theme? Would you state expressly what you believe the common theme is?
I think the common theme is that the way containers are handled in the vast part of the world are with ship-to-shore cranes.
Okay, so then what this slide demonstrates is that a belief that that's how we should be going is to a crane-based system.
Now, doesn't necessarily have to totally be that, but that is, again, if you're looking at the three missions that we have and we find ourselves in the disaster response and recovery scenario, and we have a port that actually survived and is above the waterline, what's going to get thrown at us with respect to relief? Ships that are going to come up here are going to need, more often than not, ship-to-shore cranes to offload, because the vast majority of what the industry puts on the water require ship-to-shore cranes. And I want to talk a little bit about railroad because I don't want to give you the impression we're picking on tote, because they have absolutely come up with a brilliant solution for operating a railroad operation in this geography. It's astounding that you can have a railroad vessel that comes in here and doesn't have to worry about what the tide cycles are. You can offload it and unload it all day long. In fact, they're in and out of here in 9 hours. It's astounding that they're able to do that. So, hats off. That is a pretty impressive railroad operation, no matter where you go on the planet. But when you look at what the rest of the industry calls railroad, this is what it is. It's big vessels that mostly move vehicles. They move very, very little cargo, but they move a lot of things on wheels. And they carry their ramps with them and require lots and lots and lots of laydown area to unload and offload. And even the military, this is a military railroad vessel. We see these all the time. The LMSRs that come up here to pick up U.S. Army Alaska when they're deploying and redeploying. They carry their ramps with them. The challenge with these, and the fact that Tote was able to solve this problem with their railroad configuration, is that these guys are tide restricted. This is not a great place to bring a railroad vessel. And so that's why we see them so infrequently in what it is the normal railroad vessel configuration, because they just have maybe 2 or 3 hours on either side of a tide cycle to get the work done. Then they have to stop and wait till the tide is right again before they can finish. Military doesn't care about that, but in the business world, and time is money, you're looking for a configuration that buys you that time and saves you that money, and that's Tote's superpower. They figured that out, how to do it with a railroad. But it's we don't say we have a railroad dock here, because we really don't. So again, this is what, this is what the industry could very well send our way now and in the future, or in the case of an emergency, not something this big. But these are the, here you can get an appreciation of what those really big ones look like up against the dock. But at the end of the day, it's this row it's this lift on, lift off configuration that is likely going to find its way to anchorage more often than not. Okay. So before I turn this over to David, I've got a couple of slides to talk about, cost benefit, not from the money standpoint, but cost benefit from the operational practicality of doing it now or deferring and doing it later. And this is just kind of a scenario of if we go with this configuration and build this, what happens if we lose terminal 2? Well, if we happen to lose just terminal 2, then we still have terminal 1. Terminal 1 is where the ship-to-shore cranes will be. So the likelihood that we'll be able to continue operations with other than the usual users up here is pretty highly likely. But it also allows to get at least one of Tote's ramps in the game, so Tote can come up here. Nobody should think that if we find ourselves in an emergency disaster response situation, that there's an expectation for business as usual anyhow. It's going to be a pickup game until we can get enough of the other terminal back in shape to be able to go back to some sense of normalcy. So if we're operating in an emergency, then we're sub-optimized anyhow. But if the damage was to terminal 2 and you're using terminal 1, you can get more bang for the buck in that configuration, because that's where the ship-to-shore cranes are. If the tables were turned and the damage is in terminal 1, you can't move those cranes to terminal 2. It's not wide enough. So now you are limited to Tote's 2 vessels for sure, and anybody else who you could bring up here on the off days, where you would have to get a crane, just a crane on the dock to lift off one container at a time. It's going to take a heck of a lot longer to turn that kind of a vessel, or even a barge, if you will, than it would normally. So there's a readiness component that I think is worth considering when we talk about whether or not let's do this now and do the rest later, or do what it is we're recommending to be done in the first place. And the other piece of it is this, when you're looking at the operational cost benefit relationship, there's really 2 points of view. The user's big concern is, what are you asking me to pay for that I get no value out of? But you as the owners, I believe, have to ask, what is it we need to support the 3 missions that we need to support now? And what is the cost of not having what it is we need if we've waited too long and the need arrives before you've put the infrastructure in place because you thought you were 30 years away, 20 years away, 10 years away? So I think the way we should approach it, or the way I'm suggesting you approach this, is to think of it more about what's the cost of readiness, and is it a cost worth deferring? Now, I'm going to stop because because there were some questions asked the last time about, okay, then what is the money cost of all of this? And David's got a few slides here, and we'll address those now.
Thanks, Steve. And once again, I'm David Ames from Jacobs Engineering, the PAMP program manager. I would like to make a couple comments about the master plan discussion that was going on before, just to clarify. I definitely agree that a master plan would be the way to approach a project like this. I will say, as Steve said, that there are components of a traditional master plan that have gone into the planning of this, and I think that a master plan wouldn't necessarily change the fact that we're having this discussion over whether to design to a specific user or not. But what a master plan would do, and I think Ms. Brawley mentioned this specifically, is it would ascertain a lot of these demand assumptions that are being made about what the growth of the fleet would be, what the ultimate cargo demands would be, whether there's going to be growth or shrinkage in the markets. And that is very critical to making a lot of these decisions. So I would advocate for that type of work in the future. Moving on to this, the additional cost to the program to widen Terminal 2. You've heard in past presentations a cost of roughly 150 to 200 million. Well, we've gotten a little more specific. Right now, the design is for 120-foot wide berth at Terminal 1. As Steve mentioned earlier, there's consideration of an additional lane behind the crane rail that's been requested by the user that would widen it to 134 feet. That's a study that's going on in the Terminal 1 design of record contract. And that decision, whether to widen Terminal 1 or not, it was another decision that will come before the Design Advisory Board and the Change Management Board and potentially the Assembly if it's recommended later this summer. So what we've done is presented the costs of going to a uniform dock width at Terminal 2 for both the 120-foot option or configuration and the 134 width configuration. And the structure, and in the layout you see the structure, but it's not just about structural costs. It's also about if you are truly making Terminal 2 usable by by ship-to-shore crane operations, you are also needing to add the utilities, the rails, the crane trench, the Panzerbilt trench that Steve mentioned that would go into the deck. There would be an additional mobilization season for the additional year it would take to construct that width, and then there would be additional overhead and general conditions, and as well as a contingency. So you can see the numbers there. Based on the current design at Terminal 2, you've got about a $2,245 per square foot structural cost, plus all the additional costs there. The total in current day dollars for the one option is about 147 million. The other is 182 million. And then escalated to 2029, which is what we would call the midpoint of construction for Terminal 2, which is how we do our estimates. It would be 175 million for the one option, 217 million for the other option. I have some other things to discuss, but I'll ask if there are any questions about that first.
Ms. Brawley and then Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, just briefly. So I was just doing some quick math. So it looks like in today's dollars, the difference between these two choices of how wide the dock would be is about 35 million. And it looks like that's about a 23% increase from the 146 to 181. And then I didn't get as far as the other percentage, but then in the 2029 dollars, that's about a $41.8 million difference. So granted, these are very preliminary, but that's the scale of what we're looking at in terms of the difference between these two decisions or these two options.
That's the difference for these two options are just for Terminal 2. For Terminal 1, it would be a similar scale, yes, for that widening.
Thank you.
And that's on top of the 1.8 billion or 2.2 billion. So I'm not sure where that'll fit, but Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, and just to make sure I'm following this correctly, when we're talking about what we're proposing here to widen Terminal 2, you're essentially talking about going from the August 2022 design to the current proposed design. Is that right?
That's correct. We're going from the continuous dock design, what we called the interim design in the last presentation, but it's the August 2022 design to the uniform dock design.
And so as Ms. Brawley pointed out, we'd be talking about updating the design from August 2022 to the current design. And then if we went to the 134 width standard, that would also impact Terminal 1. And there would also be additional costs not reflected in this slide to go to that design, to go to the currently proposed design at 134 foot width, correct?
That's correct. There would be an increase. And as you've mentioned, it's about a $35 million increase in this. I do expect it to go down in cost, partly because this is more structural engineering work, but we are looking for a way to cantilever that back lane rather than have to put a pile under it, so the cost would go down. But we're still talking about an order of magnitude in the $25 to $40 million range, right? But that's what the study that's coming from the designers is going to tell us what that cost is.
Mr. Volland?
Thank you. Okay, so I don't know if I'm tracking quickly enough with all these numbers that we're throwing around here, but what I would like to know, and I think maybe we had this in our previous presentation from you guys, but the difference in cost between the current proposed cargo dock basis of design, total, both terminals, and then the current approved cargo dock basis of design, AO 2021-56.
I could give you some round numbers. I'd have to do some quick calculations, but I thought we got away from those numbers simply because for the last year and a half with the legislation, with the legislative asks, we've had that interim design, that August 2022 design as the basis for the budget for the project. But I can give you some round numbers.
I mean,
that I
I
thought we
think,
covered
I
last
think a
time.
round number for each scenario would be helpful.
Okay, I can put some together by the end of the discussion.
Awesome, thanks.
And for future conversations, I would like a cost per pile. I would like to understand what we're talking per pile, per dock, so that we can understand what we're talking about in terms of the cost from the intermediate. I think we can all agree not to go back to the original plan because there was a unanimous vote of the design advisory board. So we don't have to go back to that point, but for the two, I would like to understand the cost per pile and then the increased cost per pile. It's just giving me a way to look at it in a sectioned way, in a modular way.
Can I, do you mean per pile? I mean, because it's there, I can't really give you that right now. We would have to go back and look at the
Yeah,
different
I
number
don't
of
expect
piles.
it off the top of
right?
your head.
Or would per square foot,
No,
as long as it's an
no.
apple to apple, would it matter?
I guess, but I mean, this design is great because the picture, your side view of cargo docks with 100 gauge cranes, it shows 9 rows or 9 columns, and I imagine by a ton of rows. And the concept for the intermediate has a lot fewer of these
Yeah.
pilings. And so I would like to understand what the docks cost also in like kind of per pile, so I can understand what we're buying. Because ultimately, going back to where we got here from, it's the failing of
So-
the piles that's
Right.
the issue.
So the docks, first of all, the section that you're looking at is actually, that widened section you're seeing is actually the access trestle because you're seeing a cross section through the access trestle.
So it's not, that's not the
So-
width of an entire dock. Underneath the crane is the dock part. To the right of it in that
That
graphic is
is
a
the
trestle.
access trestle.
If that's 100-foot crane and you cantilever it down 100 feet across, it's pretty close.
No,
it's not.
Can you put actually it's slide number 6. But what I can tell you is that per pile, both docks are going to cost roughly the same. It costs the same to install a pile at Terminal 2 as it does at Terminal 1. And so I think the unit costs could be presented in a different way if you're looking for a modular cost.
Okay, let me
right?
restate that. It's cost per pile and then number of piles per.
Okay.
Right, that's what
right.
that's what I really meant, is the cost per pile and then the number of piles per dock. I should have had my equation a little more clear.
Well, we can definitely give you some unit costs that'll help you compare. And
Thank you.
if I, probably a more productive and maybe more useful comparison would be a cost per ton of product that come across the dock or cost per throughput.
Yeah, I think we're expecting that information. Maybe it would be nice to see it broken down by different style of terminal, but I think we are expecting today to understand the cost per gallon of milk, and so that's based on the cost per ton.
That's more related to the surcharge, correct? So
Yeah, it is.
that's more related to the surcharge issue, but
The whole point of this conversation, I thought, was to understand what the costs are of the design. So as we make a decision of a design, we understand the implications on the gallon of milk or a car based on the specifics of each of the docks, right?
correct.
So we're separating them because we have legislative packages, but
Mhm.
it's
So-
an artificial. What we need to understand is what's this going to cost our community?
So this is the cost of construction, the total cost of constructions of the changes that we're talking about, right? Now, the cost per unit of construction, whether it's per square meter or per pile, is going to be very similar for both docks, okay? The cost I mean, they're the same types of structures. They're going to be slightly different. There are going to be slight differences because the docks have different functions, but the cost per square foot of concrete, the cost per pile are going to be very similar for both docks. So you look at we look at the total cost of the project, and then if you're comparing, when you're looking at the cost of what it's going to cost for what the cost increase to a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, that is related. We're as I've mentioned with Ross Wiswald before, he manages the financial side. We deal with the technical, but I give him cost. But the cost, the increases in those costs is not related to what necessarily the total project cost is. It's the amount borrowed, but that the city has to borrow. In other words, if you build this and you get $175 million worth of funding from the federal government, it's not going to
Right. Okay, I'm going to
change
interrupt you
it.
there.
So
And
that's a finance
I
plan.
am going to
part,
interrupt you there and
right?
say the question though was based on the last meeting, based on an assumption that there's no additional magic money coming from Uncle whomever that's going to pay for our expenses. Base the costs on what we expect to pay from today going forward. You can scrap out what we've already received for third-party money. What are those costs going to be? And I want to go back though to what I'm asking for, just to make sure I'm really clear. I was mistaken when I said the cost per pile. It's the cost per pile per dock. So the cost per pile by the number of piles per dock design.
Okay.
That way we can see the cost. That's what I'm hoping to understand is, and then we can scale it up to this. And I understand you're saying here, this $175 million or 146,600
Yeah.
to widen to 120 feet on Terminal 2.
Yeah.
None of this gives us the big picture. The big picture is whatever that number is, 101,860 some thousand or 200 and change plus this number, plus if we're going to widen it for both, we can't see it in these small bites. We have to see the big picture.
I think I understand what you're asking. I will say though, again, if you ask for the number of the cost per number of piles, and then you have the number of piles per each dock, you reach these total numbers that we're looking at.
Right.
So
I wouldn't disagree with
and-
that, but we'll see what the costs are for the projects.
okay,
We can do that.
yeah, okay. Do you want to put up that backup slide of? No, this is a similar cost estimate. Mr. Constant, you had asked for this last time. What can we do to convert Terminal 1 to accommodate RoRo? And 2 new trestles built as independent structures would be added to the area inshore of the terminal. We'd recommend building them after Terminal 1 so that Terminal 1 could be completed post, or completed as quickly as possible and operating. Actually, I should say, I say recommend. We don't recommend actually doing this, but if you did, we would recommend putting these 2 trestles in after. These are the costs related to them. You can see it's a cost per trestle and a total cost per the pair. It's about $104 million to add these. These are based again on the unit costs that were developed for the other individual trestles. And they are escalated to $2030 because that's when you would expect to do it. But this would then allow you to space the trestles to accommodate the Orca class of vessels and make Terminal 1 suitable for a normal tote RoRo operation as well. So this was
helpful
requested.
information. I did request it, and I requested it for a reason. in the meetings I had done with the various operators, it had been asserted to me that the design that was being proposed was mirrored. And I never saw that in the costs. And so now we understand that only the design was mirrored, not the actual costs were mirrored. And so the information I received was inaccurate because it asserted a mirrored design at the lower cost. And so I'm trying to sort through the rhetoric and get to the facts here. And so this is helpful. And I wouldn't suggest designing double today because we're already talking about a design that is in excess of the capacity we need and can demonstrate we need for a very long time.
Right.
And so, but that same argument works for Terminal 2. That's the issue that I'm struggling with is why would we make a massive investment for a market that may emerge to have two, other than your resiliency argument, but it doesn't, who's paying for that is the part that I'm concerned about when we get to that. Anyhow, so thank you for providing this information because now we can understand it's $100+ million in addition if we're going to actually get to a mirrored dock above any number we've seen yet.
Okay. And these were pictures you had asked to show how it could be designed as separate structures. Trestles at the existing Ro-Ro terminal were added as separate structures, and these are just photos demonstrating how that's done. And there's an expansion joint allowing for the transportation connection between the two,
So they're technically.
but they are
not-
technical.
So
technical
what I had
separate
actually-
They're not
structures.
physically
Right.
connected.
What I had actually asked for was not photographs, but a budget that demonstrated the costs of doing Terminal 1 Lolo with this potential for Ro-Ro in the future sometime, and then Terminal 2 with Ro-Ro with the potential to do this in the future. What would those costs be if we wanted
So-
to build just the single dock with expansion capability for both?
A single dock or a single berth?
The language, I'll
It-
never get the
it's-
language exactly right because I don't
But
live
that's
this
why
stuff.
we're here.
Yeah, I don't live this stuff. But the idea being, because we're talking with Terminal 1 and Terminal 2, Terminal 1 having both Lolo and Ro-Ro, and Terminal 2 having just, excuse me, we're talking about Terminal 1 having just Lolo, and then Terminal 2 having both Lolo and Ro-Ro capabilities.
And the way to do that is to extend the crane rail into Terminal 2
And so
and the infrastructure to support it.
the question that I had asked relating to this picture at the last meeting was, can we get a financial assessment, a kind of a rough, at least understanding of what it would cost to just do Terminal 1 Lolo, Terminal 2 Ro-Ro only, plus have this built in as a future stage of both projects when there's a market demand.
Yes. So, Steve, if you could go to the backup slide that,
Humor me, because it's going to take a
Sure.
little while.
So
Oh my.
I think you have this, right? Because I think the assumption's been made that you would have to change,
I took that.
that you would have to change the Terminal 1 design in order to be able to build these as separate structures, and you don't, right? You build the existing terminal, and then you build these trestles as separate structures in the future.
David, where am I going?
If you go, you see the red slide, slide number 14.
37?
Oh, 34, sorry.
34. Oh, okay.
Okay. So
Let me see if
the current design, meaning the interim design, okay, is designed with Terminal 1 and Terminal 1 designed as a ship-to-shore crane operation. Terminal 2 designed with the trestle spaced for Ro-Ro, for the Orca class vessels, and a continuous dock, right? It is designed with the expandability for the future of building that red back reach area in the future at a later date, if and when needed. It will be needed because the Orca class vessels will go out of service. So, other operations are going to need that ship to shore crane, but the current design allows for that expandability. There, other than minor accommodations at the edges of the dock and the addition of a crane rail up front, there's not a significant change that has to be made. Similarly, Terminal 1 is already designed with the ability to bring in those other 2 trestles if you needed to.
Right.
So I don't have a table that shows the current costs plus the future costs, but I can certainly put one together quickly. But we already have all of that information, and the current design is intended with this expandability. What you're being asked to decide on is whether or not to build that future expansion now. And it's, that is up to the city to decide whether that's in their financial interests or not.
Okay, that's super, super helpful information that I was really trying to get to, because when I come back to the question of who's paying, if we do expand that design to be the full enchilada, but not double, only double on one side, our port operators effectively, except for what we've seen from federal investment, are going to end up paying over time all of those costs, which means we are. And that's really the crux of this issue to me. So I'm going to leave you alone now, because I think I finally got the information I needed on the
and-
table.
Well, and I should say, these are designed
It's a good talk.
with the idea that now that future expansion isn't just designed to be expandable. It's also designed with the ability to build it without interruption
Yeah.
to operations. There may need to be some minimal disruption, but it would not be a significant
So
disruption.
the cost factor for that we've already seen, because that's the intermediate design. So that's one of the sets of numbers we'll be chewing on when we come to the point where these two conversations converge, the design and the tariff. Kevin or Mr. Cross, Ms. Bradley. and then
Yeah,
Mr.
going
Volunteer.
back to your primary presentation, slide number 22. I guess it really comes, this slide here pretty much summarizes it all for me. If you got in your page 11, slide 22 towards the bottom there. And that, yes, Terminal 2 has the ability to expand, which is extremely helpful information. But it's that, if there's loss, damage, or there's an issue with Terminal 1, I think the hangup I have is that in the accuracy of the statement that only 2 vessels in the world can operate efficiently on that T2 configuration. And we really have backed ourselves into a corner, assuming that if that is an accurate statement, that there are only 2 vehicles, or excuse me, two ships that can service that port. And we lose terminal, or we have an issue on Terminal 1, whatever that looks like, damaged, somebody runs into it, earthquake, whatever that looks like. We've pretty much just painted ourselves in a corner by not having a uniform standard across where we can then move, and utilize Terminal 2. Otherwise, oh no, how long will it take us to build? And we know that, it's not going to happen overnight. I guess that's my concern is, at the same time, if I only need a half-ton truck, do I buy a 1-ton? But if I anticipate I'm going to need a 1-ton truck, do I think it's going to be cheaper now or cheaper in the future? And so, thank you so much.
Ms. Bradley,
I could play catch up unless there's more questions. I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut people off.
we have a slate of people in the queue. So it's Ms. Bradley, and then Mr. Vaughn, and then Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Mr. Cross brings up a great point, which is, that we do need to think about our long-term needs, not just the users who are going to be working at this port, but also, what happens in a disaster. Certainly that's closer to all of us than we maybe want to think about day to day. But I keep thinking about, again, what is the total cost of this going to be and how do we phase it? Because I think there is a valid argument for building it all as soon as possible, like building in that expansion now. There's certainly a valid argument for the using the design that we have as of August 2022, and then building in that expansion later. But my concern is that if we choose the building expansion later, it seems like we still need to have some kind of plan or phasing that accounts for that. And so then I'm curious, I guess the question for the team then is if we did that, is there a possibility to add an additional phase, basically one past all of the ones that are in the queue right now or are in the plan? And then if we build in that marginal cost, what is the implication of, for example, choosing a tariff that reflects the design that we have right now, this future expansion design, and then would that just trigger an additional tariff in the future at that phase? Or I'm just thinking of the practicality of this, because again, I think there's value in making the big picture decision, even if we don't pay for it all or build it all right now.
I'll let David handle the engineering side of that, and I'll take a stab at the tariff-related part of your question. Okay. Did you want to go first?
Oh,
Yeah.
sure.
That's the important part.
Yeah, so the technical
Money part's
side,
a little bit easier to address.
absolutely, there is a way to add those phases. I mean, right now, the phases are technically 5, but they've been modified in the past, and there's no requirement. If the city elects to change that, there can certainly be different phases, and whether these are done as part of the PAMP project or whether they are done as a future project, it's absolutely possible to consider.
So with respect to the tariff, to make the adjustments in the tariff that would go to address adjustments in what it is we're constructing. Yeah, the process does that now. The process does that now for the port that, absent talking about the modernization program, we're always reviewing what the cost of things are. And do we have enough revenue coming in based on the current tariff to address those kinds of things? Add the surcharge to the tariff, and that all gets glommed into those same reviews. But we've also committed to taking a special look at the surcharge part more frequently than we do to the rest of the tariff. So I think we have a plan in place to keep up with what could be potential either unforeseen or scheduled changes that might require adjustments to the rates. I think that's the process is there to do that. You guys may not stand the frequency of us coming back to you to ask you for those adjustments. We try to minimize that as much as possible, but there's a process for doing that we will adhere to.
And just very briefly, I just want to again state my interest is that we make a decision about the entire modernization project, which can include additional phases, can include contemplating a future tariff surcharge, all of those things. But I'm not saying that we should put any of that or punt any part of that decision, just that maybe we can stretch out or extend how we actually do it. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually have two more or 3 more slides. What do you think?
But I still have 2 more people in the queue. So Member Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the framing of this as, we are the owner operator. And it's kind of funny. Kevin sort of beat me to the punch. I was thinking, we have a crumbling port that we really need to replace, and it's very urgent. And I was sort of also thinking of the car analogy, right? And for me, I was thinking more like a family vehicle. If my Honda is out of date and it's breaking down, I come from a Honda family. I think we're going to buy a new Honda that's going to last us the next 10 years. And I guess the question that I have is are we trying to replace a Honda with a Cadillac? Just when it comes to the cost comparisons. And then also with extending the car metaphor, a question that I have is, often we hear these projections about future use, future demand. How many more goods will be shipped? How many more boats are going to use the port? Right now, or I guess over the past year, the Assembly has been trying to pressure DOT to reevaluate a highway expansion, the Seward Highway, expanding it up to 6 lanes. And at the time when that document was written in 2006, there were these really optimistic projections about traffic demand and population growth. And what we've seen is a complete reversal of those projections. And, when you do reading about transportation planning, you'll see a lot of articles that are swirling right now about why transportation modeling might be junk science, because it is often the case that those projections don't hold up, right? So that being said, I guess I'm curious about what are the past trends and future projections of goods coming through our port. So just kind of throw that out there as sort of a question. And then, just want to state too that I like fancy things and new technology and big boats. I have naval architects in my family. But I think for me, that slide 14, with room to grow, if and when the business case IDs the need, I guess I just want to hear more about that business case, that demand, what is the future shipping capacity that we truly need, not just like the most robust version of the biggest thing that we could ever build.
Well, let me give you the port director's point of view on that. After about 16 years of watching what's come across the dock. First, when we finish with this modernization program, whether we go with the option we're presenting to you today, or we go to the interim one, we are building a dock shorter than the one we have now, because the business case to get any bigger than that does not exist. So we've taken it upon ourselves to look at what makes the most sense to build, given the market space that we were in. And we are a consumer state. When you're a consumer state, what matters most is the volumes that are coming across the dock inbound. We, as a state, manufacture for export and sale to other states, nations, what have you, nothing. So it's all about goods that come in that matter. That's what drives the size and the need for what it is we have. And that's what we've taken into consideration here. And I would argue that if nothing exciting happens to the size of the state population, I mean, we operate today at the dock we have now at a utilization rate of 40%. That means 60% of the time, there's nothing going on there, because it doesn't take a lot to feed less than 1 million people. So the state's population can quintuple before we'd have to think about adding more port. We'll just, in the meantime, add more port calls. So we've sized this thing to handle what we see in the foreseeable future. And I would bet, if I was going to be around in 70 years, I would bet you that we're not going to see much difference in the size of the population between now and then, because nothing exciting is happening here that's drawing people in. So we can predict the demand, we can forecast the demand, and we can build and size to that. But if the DoD doesn't go away, or earthquakes stop, then we can reconsider some of those portions of the expense of this thing that have to do with supporting those two parts of our mission. But I think we've right-sized this. I really do. And I am not worried about not having enough port for more than the foreseeable future. But the issue is, we can't drive the Honda anymore, because the industry isn't building Hondas anymore. And they're building bigger cars. So we need to be able to support that. The really, really big ones, as I said, we just don't have the market space here. We don't have the transportation connections that make Anchorage a great place to go instead of Los Angeles. We don't have that. We have the capability to manage that if that becomes a business case in the future. But what we need in the foreseeable future is pretty much what it is we're asking to build. And I think that's plenty big enough. Where port use may go up has more to do with mineral extraction and those kinds of opportunities than it's going to do with, stuff people want to eat or clothes people want to wear. And as I mentioned, with a 40% utilization rate, we can fit that in now without having to worry about extending that dock out to the north end. If something happens that says, you know what, a third container carrier might be called for here, or another party that comes in with another unique business model, we have a place to go to accommodate that. And then we worry about that expense when that time comes, and we challenge whoever that business is that's looking for the opportunity to help pay for that, because right now we don't need it. But I really don't lose any sleep thinking we've shorted ourselves with what it is we're trying to do. Oh, okay.
So I guess when you talk about making it a Cadillac, a Cadillac would be a terminal with the same size cranes, but with many more cranes, right? So the way this is sized, Steve's right. It's sized for the current demand, but it is designed to be expanded and expanded reasonably easily. It's expensive to build terminals here, so you try to not get too far ahead of yourself and put that burden on the community. But it's designed to be expanded. If you needed to expand berth 1, the capacity of berth 1, the way you would expand it is to add cranes to it. You would serve more ships more rapidly, right? And you could potentially serve larger ships. Same way, if you need to start serving longer ships, you either build the uniform dock that's being requested now, or you expand it the way I mentioned when the Orca class go out of service. You expand it so that now you're serving longer ships that way, or you build towards the end of it. And so I wouldn't consider this the Cadillac, because I actually think that in the container shipping industry, the biggest advantage in shipping is the standardization of the products, of the cargoes, the sizes, everything. And so you had mentioned, Mr. Constant, the modularity of this earlier. It may not appear modular to you, but it is modular, because you add the same size cranes that can handle larger ships or ships more rapidly. You widen the dock to a standard width, and then you extend the dock further if you need more. On the inshore side, that's a whole different story. You have ample space back there. You would go up. You would start stacking if you needed more space. There is plenty of expandability here, and I don't think we're getting ahead of ourselves. But to your point about demand, a market study and a demand study would be a key part of the master planning that Ms. Brawley mentioned.
Thanks. So a quick follow-up, and just bringing this to the ordinance, just so I'm clear. This ordinance approves the upgraded design, correct?
Passing that ordinance would approve going forward with the basis of design that we presented as the recommendation to replace the original one. There never was a assembly vote on this interim one that we've all really been using, but it would go from the one that was
Are we
originally.
skipping the interim with this?
Yes.
Okay, so what might be helpful, I thought that this was really effective when we, at our previous regular meeting, when Member Rivera presented, we were doing the sanctioned camping thing. I know that isn't relevant to this, but he gave us the option, right? He gave us an S1 and an S2 version. And I think it might be interesting, instead of, to essentially give the assembly the option of the interim design or the biggest and beefiest and maybe best via two different versions of an ordinance.
But and that's not hard to do. In fact, I think we may have proposed that already. I'll talk to Bob Owens, because Bob Owens was helping us put those together. So let me find out where we are on that. And if there's a modification that has to get made, then we'll take care of that. So before you see it on the 20th, assuming you don't postpone it, if we see this on the 20th, you'll have an S version that is other than what we would ideally like to see done. Great.
So Bob, one model of that could be the checkbox version. So you could use the basis of this with an amendment that has checkboxes. We've used that model, or S version either way could work. We can talk about the mechanics of that. Sorry, our attorneys are all traveling right now. They could provide some aid. I think Dean will be back on Monday. And so, yeah, and I just jump in briefly and say, I think the Cadillac is an interesting metaphor. The Cadillac version, I think, was the first design that we started wrestling with in 2018. This is not the Cadillac version. This is more like going from the Honda to the 15-passenger van when you're expecting your family to grow by a couple. And and maybe the future will fill out that van, or maybe we will turn on a tourist business and start selling tours for those other 12 seats with our family. To me, that's more close. I'm trying to figure out a way to tune it in. It's not about the cost, about the demand and use. Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to say I like Mr. Mullen's proposal. I think that'd be a nice way to kind of frame it and kind of do a fairly straightforward apples to apples comparison in my mind. My question, just to make sure my assumption here is correct, because we talk about, the disaster scenario and the need to have some redundancy. With the interim design, Terminal 2 could still be utilized by the military ro-ro type vessels and military warships and all that. I mean, the only thing it's not equipped or would not be equipped to handle would be the low type operations, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The rail-mounted Lolo operation.
But didn't we have a slide that showed there were both kinds of ships that the military is bringing up, DOD?
Yeah.
There is, I think, the
there
slide
there
with
was
the
the one
Ro-Ro
slide
ship.
that had those, they're called LMSRs, when the divisions deploy. Those are the vessels that when they don't contract that out to a commercial carrier, those are the vessels that will come up here to load.
Right.
Now, if we put two of them at the dock at the same time, they have to dock stern to stern, because there isn't enough maneuvering room even on the dock as it exists now to dock them the same way.
Right. My point of the interruption was to suggest that both will show up if the DOD is the main. Maybe it's more crane loading operations with the military. I don't know, but it's both.
Right. Yeah, your point is well taken. I guess I'm just trying to imagine, because we talk about the disaster scenario, if we lose a terminal, what sort of operations are we able to accommodate just to keep people in Alaska alive?
So if you lost, I think Steve had the slide that if you lost Terminal 1, you would have Terminal 2. If you're talking about the interim design, you would have Terminal 2. You'd have the Orca class Ro-Ro operation. You could manage the military operation with their Ro-Ro. You could bring in a mobile crane, and take containers off a Matson vessel or other container vessel, just much slower than the rail-mounted operation. So it would function in a contingency operation, just not as efficiently as the other.
And that's why I had mentioned it. Nobody should have an expectation in a disaster response recovery scenario that business as usual could ever happen.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Cross.
So I'm just going to step back a little bit because I'm kind of curious about this process. We just talk about our two service providers, Matson and Tote, right? There are two 900-pound gorillas that are down at the port operating, and the military that comes in. But I'm kind of curious on what that looks like as far as those are just the two companies that we're dealing with. Is there a bid process? What does that look like, and what is that agreement that those individuals get established? Are they leasing space? And the reason I'm asking for is because no fault to any one of the service providers, but essentially my other thought process is by just building a section of the port that only services a very specific vendor, do we not have an option? I mean, I don't know if it's a bid process or what that looks like, but I mean, can you speak to that process of how we identify those individuals that bring cargo in and that agreement?
I will do the best. I'll do the best I can. And well, in my short history here, it's been anyone interested in coming up here is going to make a visit and examine the landscape and see what capabilities we have and what room they have for them. Perfect example, when Horizon Lines declared Chapter 11, we knew there was a potential of one of the two ocean carriers just packing up and leaving. But Matson, before we ever put an ad in the newspaper saying, hey, wanted, ocean carrier, Port of Anchorage, the industry knows what's going on, and we got a call from Matson. Matson said, we'd like to come up here and have a look at your place. They came up originally about 8 months earlier to see if there was room for a third ocean carrier, and took a look at things, or at least that's what they told me, and they are under no obligation to show me all their cards. But they came up here to take a look around, and when they left, it was, hey, thanks for your time, but this is a pretty well taken care of market. There's no room for a third. Yeah. But then Chapter 11, Horizon Lines filed Chapter 11, and Matson bought Horizon Lines. And we came in one Friday morning. The sign in the building said Horizon Lines. When we left at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it said Matson. And all the same faces that we dealt with for years were all the same people that were there. And that transition was pretty smooth. And we see transition all the time. We've had petroleum companies come and go. We've had petroleum companies sell the infrastructure to others. So that, that kind of thing has happened. And outside of the fence at the port, nobody really pays attention. But it does happen. And we don't miss a beat. We have not had to go in search of people to come up here. Because the industry abhors a vacuum, and it knows what's going on. And if somebody does choose to leave, they're happy to do it. And somebody will come in and fill the space. I don't lose sleep wondering if any decision we make is going to annoy somebody enough to want to pack up and leave, and we're left holding the bag. That's not going to happen. The industry will fill the hole, and they'll fill the hole pretty darn quickly. I hate to see either of these companies leave, because I think we have really good working relationships with them, and they both do a great job, and they're good customers to deal with. The contract arrangements we have with both of them are what we call preferential user agreements. It gives them a guarantee that that berth is theirs, on the days they need it, and it's specifically called out in there what days they get it, with plus or minus times, because nothing happens really perfectly all the time. And you're a little bit early, you're a little bit late, and you got to leave slot for that. But we have those arrangements with them, and they're working well.
So worst case scenario, I mean, not worst case scenario, you can get really creative worst case scenario. If regretfully 10 years in the future, Tote experienced a bankruptcy or something like that, and they were no longer able to provide services due to larger, how would that affect the Terminal 2 under the current proposed design? If for whatever reason, they're no longer able to bring those two ships up?
But with the interim design, it would depend on who's coming in to fill the gap. And I think what I've been trying to, have everybody appreciate is the likelihood that whoever's going to fill that gap is going to need ship-to-shore cranes. If we select that interim design, then we don't have sufficient infrastructure to give a terminal to somebody, because it's not wide enough for the cranes we have. That would be the challenge there.
Steve, but that's assuming we have more than 40% usage, right? So you already said we could accommodate another user,
All right,
just another day. We could even do, because they're here 2 days a week, we could do a number of more users just based on what we have today.
And you're right. And frankly, we could kind of put a pin in this whole argument and say, why don't we just build one berth that both can use, and not build two? But that has a whole set of challenges to it that make it a nonsensical decision.
Especially Tacoma, the fact that we are a tiny little cog in a giant wheel in Tacoma, and we get what we get.
And we've actually examined that possibility, and I think we've collectively shot it in the head for a whole lot of different reasons.
Time check. We have 30 minutes, Mr. Johnson.
No, you addressed it.
All right. So yeah, this is just such an interesting conversation.
Oh, okay.
Now we probably should give you the floor back so you can finish
Okay.
your presentation.
Well, I'm gonna show my last slides, and then I think there's one that goes to your gallon of milk
Okay,
question
good.
that's in our backups that I'll put up there.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, but I'll move very quickly. This has been a great discussion, and I think everybody appreciates the fact that you guys as the owners are going to make a 75-year decision.
sorry, before you move on, Mr. Martinez, go ahead. You are in the queue. Okay, and also Ms. Brawley, but she said after. Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, you're making a 75-year decision, and we would like you to give consideration to the fact that we need to be as flexible and prepared as possible for what the future can throw our way. That is the most important decision that we make when we select this design. We don't have a responsibility to guarantee anybody that uses the port that they're going to make a profit if they come down there. That's their business responsibility to make happen. What we cannot do is create a facility that hampers them from efficiently operating or making it any more difficult for them to operate with what it is we build than what it is they're capable of doing now. The other, because we are the public sector, the other thing we have to be careful of doing is not making a decision that gives one user a competitive advantage over the other. We cannot find ourselves in that situation. And at the end of the day, this all gets rolled up into a policy. This is a policy call. It's a policy call more than anything else. And we would like you to make sure it's based on those three missions that we've tried to, drive home with you that are very important to all of us. But hey, you're going to make the decision that you make, and we're going to execute it. We're going to execute it whether we're biting our tongue because we wished it would have gone another way or not. And if it's so unbearable, we'll quit. Otherwise, we will be here to execute and construct exactly what it is you guys want. And I, for as long as I'm sitting in the chair, I can guarantee you that you get the last word and we don't. And I think my next slide, I love this slide. This is a pretty slide you have.
And I would add one slight phrase to your slide about our mission is to provide as flexible and effective terminal as possible. We, as the folks who have to make the decision, also have to have the caveat on there with the resources we are comfortable expending. That's the second part of that phrase. We have to figure that part out too, which is so.
And I know I've been quoted in the paper saying, I really don't care what it costs.
Right.
It's never going to be cheaper to build than it is today.
Yeah.
And you don't want to regret not building what you're going to need down the road.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I don't envy the position you guys are in.
So Mr. Martinez and then Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, this is maybe a little down the line operationally, but just thinking of the way you talked about the new technologies on the cranes as well. And the way that it impacts the design and the infrastructure necessary to build that out. Is there any consideration at this point, or is it down the line operationally about more cranes? Right, so that if we're extending that, are we also talking about a purchase or investments in additional infrastructure of the cranes and that sort of stuff?
So related again to the expansion, the expandability of the terminal, the cranes could be added if demand required it, right? Right now, the project includes 3 cranes. So there's no consideration at the moment for increasing that number, but the ability to do that is there.
Right, and so that the current 3 cranes would, in the current proposed basis of design that you all brought today, could be able to roll down from either terminal.
So that isn't necessarily possible. It all depends on how the crane cabling is, just because they are attached to cables that are attached to, I think everybody's distracted by that now.
So let me put this down.
So the way that Steve showed you that the crane cables, they basically spool up a cable as they move up and down the terminal and they let it out. Because of the phasing of the terminal, the initial cranes will have their termination point at the south end of the terminal. So they won't have enough cable to reach terminal 2. It is possible to put that connection point closer, but it affects the phasing of the work. But those specific 3 cranes would not necessarily be able to move to terminal 2. They may need to be relocated to a different termination point to work at Terminal 2, but they couldn't just roll down one day. But we can construct termination points so that they can do that in the future. It's just that initially when Terminal 1 is built, they couldn't.
Okay,
But
and just
there are ways to
yeah,
work
that's
around it.
been really helpful. And then just thinking of the spool, are
Mhm.
our current cranes currently the spool cranes?
No,
No, they were
no,
the bus cranes.
No,
They
the
needed
current
bus
crane,
cranes.
yeah, the current cranes need the bus bar.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no spool on them.
So that would have to change necessarily.
The intent of the new design is to put the cable trench along the front end of the dock and run the cables off the spools down into that cable trench. And as David said, the challenge with phasing, the good news about phasing is you can take this thing in digestible chunks. The downside of the phasing is, you're going to have, if you want those cranes to go to the next terminal, then you're going to move that cable termination point up the road a piece. Yeah, so that you can move them further.
Yeah.
Which
That's
in
been
the
helpful.
long
Thank you.
run makes the most sense because now you have all the flexibility you need. Yeah, but the way to get there can't be instantaneous because you got to build this thing in phases.
So I'll point out that we've been successful at our mission to bore the room because half the people have left. We're at half capacity now. So next in the queue, I have Ms. Brawley.
Well, this job takes stamina, that's for sure. So quick point on the cranes, but I had a separate question. It's my understanding the 3 cranes that are being proposed are actually not in the public cost of the facility. Is that right? So they're being paid for by Matson, just the cranes?
Yeah, we're working on the purchase use agreement right now, but where it stands in the current thinking is they'll be purchased, operated, and maintained by Matson.
Okay, thank you.
At no cost to the program.
Okay. And then, so my question, this is going back to the 3 pieces of the mission of the port. And I guess first an observation, when we're talking about long-term, I was just reflecting on the fact 75 years ago was 1948. So, right after World War II, huge period of expansion for this city. And then we kept expanding outwards since then. And so I think it's not to say that we should just speculate about future wars and so on, but there's also the big factor that has not been said in this work session, which is climate change, which has, a number of effects on this state, one of which could be that our population can or could increase significantly because of our position, our strategic position on the chessboard of the world. And then, of course, our increasingly temperate climate. So I just want to also put that on the table that that's a factor that we can only speculate about, but it's possible. And so related to the military piece though, and I'm glad Mr. Johnson brought it up. So the third of our mission, so there's commercial, there's disaster relief, for the entire state. And then there's the military piece. And as I understand it, we're a commercial strategic port.
We are.
And so I was just wondering, have there been conversations about the military? Because, for example, if Terminal 2 could be well positioned to serve that need, either in a war situation or peacetime, what responsibility or what contribution could they potentially have?
Yeah, that's been the rub, and they're not just picking on us, but it's the same for every commercial strategic seaport in the country. Is there's no mechanism for DoD to give an entity like us money. Once upon a time, it was easy. There were these things called earmarks that your delegation in Washington could send money through DoD channels to you under that context. And then they went away. But now they're coming back, different name, but they're coming back. So that's not to say that they may re-evolve to that kind of an idea. But for now, it's a challenge. And we have it's a strategic seaport conference that's held every year in Newport News, Virginia. I got back from it 2 weeks ago. And because our story hasn't changed. I mean, you put a lot of demands on the commercial strategic seaports, and there's nothing in the way of contribution for those kinds of infrastructure needs you expect to have to ensure that we can continue to provide it. We should just be happy that when they use the place, they pay the bills. And so that's kind of where we all are right now. It's a big gap. I know Senator Sullivan and who is it from Washington? Other side of the aisle. Cantwell, Senator Cantwell are like-minded in that they have put into, they have put into some of these federal grant, eligibility requirements. They put in there that some emphasis should be given to commercial strategic seaports, particularly ones that when they've been evaluated by the National Port Readiness Network, have come up deficient, of which we are, as is the Port of Tacoma, the two worst grades of all the strategic seaports in the country. So there's movement towards making that kind of thing happen, but it's baby steps. And in the meantime, the hardball game that we play with the DoD is, you may not get in what we're finished everything you have now. So let us tell you in advance to not expect things to be what they are when we're finished with this. But if you're interested in having what you had, then figure out a way to help us pay for it, because that should not be on the backs of the citizens of Alaska. So it's been interesting, but we're trying to fight the good fight, and we're kind of hoping that the politics of things catch up.
Yeah, thank you. Just to remind folks, Jay Bear is the neighbor of the port. And so I appreciate your continued advocacy about that portion of the users.
I would add, if you just think about that in scale, 750,000, 120,000 Alaskans, 80% of them receive and pay for the goods that come across this dock. Being asked to underwrite the costs of the U.S. Department of Defense's global national defense mission, because there's no one coming to pay for what DoD is demanding, that then falls really onto the operators to figure out how they're going to make their business operate. It's a mess. And so it's not a clean thing to contemplate, clean and simple to say, we want to support national defense, because of course we do, but we can't pay for the United States of America.
No. And we won't fall on our swords.
We just simply can't. Well, but if our 1/3 of our mission, commercial, DoD, and earthquakes, then we are in some ways taking it on. And so that's the dilemma of this kind of, anyhow, I think.
The other interesting statistic is, back of the envelope, 20% of the freight that crosses the docks winds up in the commissaries and exchanges and the gas stations on the military bases up here. So they have a stake in the survival of this port, for not only support of the military mission, but support of the subsistence mission for families. Yes. And the nice thing about being a strategic seaport when it comes to grant time is, you get leverage out of having that title when it comes to competing for federal grants, whether it's a DOT grant, DoD grant, or what have you. If you're a commercial strategic seaport and you can, defend that mission and you have facts to support that mission, it's a leg up on some of these grant applications that others don't have.
All right, so let's go through the magic slide.
Oh, so David, go ahead.
Yeah, so Mr. Constant, this was a slide that I started working on with Ross. It's really a way of just putting out the information that he put out in his last presentation, but more visually. And so you were asking us about how the change in the width of Terminal 2 affects the tariff. And I guess the point that Ross wanted me to make and that I'll make here is that it's not so much about the overall cost, it's about the amount that's borrowed that affects the tariff. I will say any questions related to the finance, really, Ross is going to have to, Ross should be asked and will answer. I know he won't want me discussing the financial details too much other than the costs. But the way this is that the green $84 million debt scenario with the $3.40 per ton tariff increase is the one that's being proposed under the current surcharge proposal. And then everything else up there are just extreme and midpoint scenarios of potential debt that is taken on by the city. The last one there, the 1.32 billion in debt, is basically if all unfunded portions of the program under the current design, which includes the interim design, not the widened terminal, are taken on as debt, that would be the maximum tariff increase that he would expect. And those cost impacts really should be called cost impacts rather than changes in price, because they really just are the shipping cost increases for those products, and then how they convert to prices is up to the sellers. But those are the shipping cost impacts.
So just to restate it, that red box at the end with 1.3 million borrowed it's the assumption, and it's a loose number. We're not talking surgery here. We're talking kind of rough, is 14 cents a gallon. Of milk, 14 cents, we could fund the whole port. That's the assertion that's here.
According to the calculations, the tariff calculations, the price increases are correct for that specific tariff, but yeah, that's the calculation of
So
the
now
finance
this is
department.
the part of the fun show where I have to ask our friends, both Tote and Mattson, if they want to come up and reality check this a little. Does this ring true to you that this would be the costs if we projected $1.3 billion borrowing? Like $78. I guess probably want to see the math, but and maybe
Yeah.
no one's brave enough to come up and say, but
Well-
you would be welcome to.
Well, you
Either-
know, before this sees the light of day for real, you know, if anybody wants to see the math, I think that's a fair question.
So, do you want to come up? We have 10 minutes left. You can hear from both of you, either of you, neither of you, all
course.
three of you.
Of course, another way to look at this is if the state took 1 year off paying a PFD, we
Oh,
could
boy.
build a port.
That's a whole other thing, but I think
Definitely.
if it were literally 14 cents a gallon, we could build the port, I might be motivated to vote yes, but I just need to understand that that's factual. Mr. Dillon,
Yeah, I mean, as it relates to the math and breaking, this is Art Darlene, Vice President and General Manager for Tote Maritime. To be honest with you, I can't speak to the math on how you get to a gallon of milk, right? I mean, I do know $31.42 a ton increase is significant. And that will be a significant burden for Tote, for our shippers, for the shippers of Tote, and what they're going to do with that cost is up to them. And that's why I think it's especially useful that we're having this conversation, because it's not nominal. It appears so in a if you break it down into milk, but it's significant. But is this also a good time just to speak on some of the other things that were said or later?
so yeah, please, and we'll make some time for all three of you. So maybe just a couple minutes. Go ahead.
Could I just add one more thing on behalf of Ross, is that I know that I don't think anybody would be expecting that we would jump to that last scenario immediately. I think his intention would be to reevaluate the value of the tariff each year, but that would be the worst case if you immediately took on
Right,
that
and
debt.
again, we're just trying to conceptualize what's the cost. So, Mr. Cross, we only have about
Just
7 minutes. so-
Real quick, what would be helpful is, I mean, we're picking a small aggregate. We're just picking two products. What would be interesting is the average price on groceries, average price on maybe vehicles, and then building materials and what that does to homes, because they ship everything in.
Right.
And so we're just picking, but there's to give it a quantity of scale. Thank you.
And that might be a third-party analysis that has to be done, Mr. Dillon.
Thank you. Again, Art Darlene, Tote Maritime. Just a couple of things that have been said today, and I think there was a debate earlier about whether Tote built our ships and then the docks were created for the Orca-class ships. Well, Tote's been in service as a ro-ro carrier here for 49 years. We purposely built the Orca-class ships in 2003, and container ships were around as well, to serve Alaska. Alaska has unique needs that the markets that were presented today do not have, specifically out-of-gauge cargo. When I say out-of-gauge, it doesn't fit in a container. So we transport a number of military vehicles that can roll on and roll off of our ship. We service the oil and gas industry. We service the mining industry, as well as others. School buses, all these different things that don't fit in containers that fit the needs of Alaska. So those vessels were specifically designed for that reason. I would just also comment towards the end on this idea that all of a sudden the market will change significantly. I heard a couple things today that perhaps the market hasn't changed much in 20 years. So this idea that we'll start needing a JAX or a Port of Rotterdam type infrastructure, again, to me is a little out of touch. Resiliency. We talked a little bit about resiliency today. I think we might want to take a little deeper look at that. So what we're looking at is basically buying 2 cars or having a spare tire, right? So that's, I think, the decision we're making. You use the spare tire until you can buy your new car. And in each scenario, we're using a spare tire. So if we widen the length or the width of Terminal 2, Tote then is using a spare tire in Terminal 1 as presented because it's only 1 trestle. Unless you like to build the 3 trestles, which I hadn't heard today. In the event that you have a less wide Terminal 2 and a wide Terminal 1, the spare tire would be the mobile harbor crane that we talked about for Matson. So in either scenario, there's a spare tire being used for 1 carrier. And then the idea that Tote's going to use one of our Puerto Rico ships in Alaska is entirely irrelevant. That was an intentional build for the market of Puerto Rico. And as I mentioned, we built the Orca class specifically for Alaska. And our next class of ships will also be built for Alaska. The other thought, when we're just thinking about this debate, the idea, or not a debate, it's a conversation and a good one. I thank you for having it. The idea of the extending Terminal 2 in the future. Mr. Ames indicated that we will need to do it in 2015 or in 15 to 20 years, excuse me. That's also not necessarily the case. Tote can't say right now with certainty that we're going to go to a Lolo ship. It could be Roro, it could be a different type of ship. So the idea that it's for certain that we'll expand later, at least for the needs of the market, aren't necessarily true. So I would say, yeah, the Roro notion, or the notion that Roro doesn't necessarily or might not work in the future because other ports in the world have gone to container is just not an accurate thing to comparison when you're looking at Alaska. Alaska has a strong Roro component because of the uniqueness of the state, and there's a demand for that Roro component. So I wouldn't write it off as, well, in the future, we'll just put all that into containers. It's just not the case.
Thank you. And probably there's opportunity for more conversation about this. And next, we're going to have Matson speak.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dylan Faber with Matson for the record. I would say that we are looking at this purely through the lens of an operator of redundancy and resiliency. And so that's the reason why we support having uniform cargo dock design. If there were to be a disaster happen, if one of the cargo docks were to go down, the public would be looking at Matson and Tote to deliver the goods to get up here. They're not going to be calling the military, hey, send up your military ships. Those goods are likely to be coming up on one of our 2 ships. And we're hopeful that there's infrastructure down at the Port of Alaska to be able to service both of our ships. When it comes to redundancy and resiliency, it goes beyond just the dock face out there. You also have to, you're also at high risk of lower redundancy with the Washington docks, assuming something's all is well down there. There's also issues that happens with ships as well. So there's a lot more that goes into redundancy and resiliency than just the docks. And so it's our position that if you have a dock out there that can accommodate either carrier, industry standard, unique Roro, standard Roro, that's really in the best interest of Alaskans and protecting the economy. When you consider this port supports $14 billion worth of economic output each year in the state, you look at the cost differentials to be able to have that redundancy and resiliency over the 75-year life of the dock. You're looking at about $2.8 million insurance policy. What does it cost if you don't have that redundancy and resiliency? It's going to be a lot more expensive than that $2.8 million a year and impact on the economy and people's lives. So that's why we are supportive of a uniform cargo dock design. We are even supportive of having Tote's trestles on Terminal 1 to make sure that you guys can operate if something were to happen to your guys' terminal. It's all looking at through the lens of and submission that we don't own the port. These aren't our terminals. We don't even rent the docks. We have preferential use agreement, and you guys need to make decisions that's in the best interest of Alaskans when it comes to serving those 3 primary purposes of the port. So that being said, that's where we're at on it. We're always happy to have conversations, answer additional questions, But truly for us, it's redundancy, resiliency, being able to deliver those life-saving goods on a regular and reliable schedule that the Alaska economy is built on. So thank you.
Lev.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Lev Yampolsky with Petrostar. So I would actually like it, David, if you wouldn't mind pulling up slide 22 in your guys' presentation. And while you're doing that, it just shows the graphic, and I think it'd be helpful if you show the group where the current POVI is. And the point I wanted to bring up is that we are still kind of pushing off the discussion of that temporary 7-year petroleum offloading facility, because right now it would only be one. And depending on how that is solved, that could add a significant amount of cost. So to the question of, are those numbers on the milk and everything else accurate? That kind of depends on how much this additional fuel infrastructure will cost. And so cranes, big cranes that roll, and fuel infrastructure, which is generally big pipes, they don't get along well together. So where there's a problem, there's a solution that generally costs a lot of money, right? So it kind of what it comes down to. I would emphasize that I don't think this is a if you build it, they will come scenario, right? We kind of have a market that's the market. A lot of the growth has been driven by the airport, fuel for the airport, things like that, not really cargo per se. So just a couple of points there. The other item to bring up is when you talk about emergency response, whether it's in Alaska or other places, I think there's just needs to be an understanding that you're either paying for the full ability and everything to go on as needed. And I think to the question you brought up, how many of us have generators? How many of us think we should get a generator and kind of kick the can because we don't want to spend the money on it? And there's a little bit of that factor of if there is an incident, how much can you get away with and how much are you willing to get creative? South of the port, there's North Star stevedoring. They bring in barges that they struggle to offload during some high and low tide conditions, but they're still able to conduct operations. So there are other options outside of the port when you start getting into that worst case scenario. I would also argue that a lot of the cargo that comes up probably won't be as critical in an emergency response because your washing machines, your other goods probably aren't the ones you need at that time. So thank you for the opportunity. And I would highly encourage for that 7 to 10 year temporary fuel facility to be put onto the map and kind of further refined, because I think that's a hidden cost that needs to be addressed.
All right, thank you. Any other of the operators in the room that I'm not seeing hiding somewhere? No. Okay. I have a question I didn't ask. How many cranes could fit on Terminal 1?
Typically, just for serviceability and the lengths of vessels it'd be 5.
Okay,
Right.
so we could go from the 3 that's planned up to 5 possibly.
Correct.
Okay, and we have this item coming before us on Tuesday,
The
the
20th.
20th, and so a week down. We have the proposal possibly for an S version, so we have options. If there's need for more information, please let us know, and we can either seek to get that information in advance or do the inevitable, or not the inevitable, the potential of delaying. I would prefer to have this vote with Ms. Alatel back, which would be July, but I think that she and I have discussed it and she's prepared to see us vote. And so if the body chooses it's ready, that's fine. And thank you for a very rich presentation, very thought-provoking conversation. All right, everyone have a great weekend. Yeah,
There was-
who knows?
There was, Mr. Vollen had asked about the costs for the different phases. I can either do them now or just give them to you afterwards.
I can make folders of what?